r/NoSleep. Posted by you/10minute. Horror. I ran away to join a sideshow, now they won't let me leave. Please like and subscribe to support us. I hadn't set out to flip my life the way I had this week. I just wanted something different. People and a place to call home. Which was what I'd always wanted. I grew up playing hopscotch through foster houses. Being born with a rare facial deformity had caused my parents, whoever they were, to leave me outside an emergency entrance at the hospital I'd been delivered in the night before. My eyes were too far apart, and my mouth curved downwards at the corners, giving me a similar appearance to a fish. I'd been given the name Jillian at the hospital, which soon after turned into Gills, the nickname that would follow me around until now. Tonight, when Craig, my boyfriend, came over with the flyer for Lynch's sideshow, I thought it was a joke. But he'd heard details about the performers. Things he wanted to see for himself. And they were only in town for another week. So he got his two best friends to find two barely conscious dates to make a triple disaster of it. Craig was the only thing in my life that had ever been a constant. But he'd also always been strange. Maybe that was why he was with me. We'd met in one of our foster homes. He was 17 and about to be on his own after his 18th birthday. I was 13 and crushed on him because he kept the foster dad away from me. Craig stayed in touch, and when I eventually got out, I ran away and went to live with him. He was dealing drugs and had the money to support us, and anything was better than the homes. But he'd been getting increasingly paranoid. He was turning violent towards the people around him. Even towards me. He was doing too much of the coke he was supposed to be selling, and I was growing more nervous that the people he answered to would lash out at me to get to him. And the worst part was, I had no idea how to even bring any of that up to him. He didn't ask for opinions, only submission. So I stayed silent and waited for the storm to surround us. I was very familiar with it, and had only known a few sunny days in my 22 years. The six of us packed into Craig's old Pontiac Firebird. His two buddies, Darren and Wilco, had their drunk dates, Tina and Shelley, on their laps. Coke was out and they were passing around a little dish in the back. I could already tell tonight was a runaway train. I inspected the flyer for the show, which was the size of a playing card. It had the location and time info on one side, and the image of a two-headed child with their chest opened up in some medical exhibit on the other. The words Lynch's sideshow were written over it. The show was set up in an old park with dense woods surrounding it. A series of black tents were erected, linked by torches that burned a bright red. Each tent had a dim glow from inside, with shadows moving about. The whole area felt uneasy. I'd been to this park before. We used to drink here and set off fireworks. It had some of my better teenage memories. Now, it felt like no one was welcome. The only thing I can compare it to would be seeing an old teacher from your childhood, one that you really liked, being arrested for some heinous crime years later. We walked through the scarce parking lot, and up to an empty greeting podium with a sign that read to wait for your host. Craig did some more coke, but sneezed and it blew into my hair. I wanted to wring it out, but he said there was too much, so he started sniffing it. Then, from the shadows of a separate tent off to the side, a man approached us. He was the tallest person I'd ever seen. Taller than any athlete on TV or record holder I'd wager. He looked like he was on stilts. In fact, maybe he was. Our group quieted down as he arrived at the now comically undersized podium. He leaned down to speak to us, in a thick, German accent from a Cro-Magnon structured head. $10 each, he said. Craig tried to haggle the giant down, but he was a statue. So Craig buckled and paid up for the group. As the giant took the money, I noticed he had a large, white ring on his ring finger. It was so big it would be a wrist bangle for me. We were told by the giant that we could pick one of three paths. Each path would lead us to 3 different tents, lined by the torches. Craig was pissed. There were 9 tents in total and we were paying $10 each to only see 3 of them? The giant offered our money back. Craig relented, and we moved on towards the pathway intersection. We stood at the fork, pathways leading left, right and center. Craig lit a cigarette and led us down the center path. The torches only provided light when they were close. The long stretches between them left you in sheer darkness and cold. We arrived at the entrance to the first tent. Outside of it on a chalkboard, was written "Hold your breath." Everyone except Craig took a deep breath, and we held it as we walked in. The room had a sickly, yellow glow to it. The light emanated from a large, glass tube. It was over 10 feet tall, and roughly 3 feet wide. It was filled to the top with a clear, yellowish liquid. And a body floating inside like something you'd find in a genetics lab. The body's back was turned, but slowly rotated, facing us. It was a man. He was thin, and the only hair he had hung in tufts of dark moss around the sides of his head. He was naked, aside from a white ring on his ring finger. The same one as the giant, but smaller. The floating man's eyes opened. We all jumped back, breathing in for the first time. The man was alive. And he was looking out at all of us. A minute passed as we watched him, watching us. He put his hands to the glass, pressing out towards us. He had an unbearable sadness about him. Another minute passed. He was still floating inside the tube. How long could he hold his breath? I'm not up to date on record holding, but he seemed to be able to keep going. And how long was he here before we came inside? Then I realized, the man's chest was moving up and down. He was breathing. Air bubbles were coming out of his nose and mouth. What the hell? The light in the tube started to dim, and the tent went dark. It was time to move on to the next one. As we left to hit the next pathway, I turned back and could still see the man floating, staring out at us. He began to rotate away, facing the back wall again. I followed the path with a newfound chill in my bones. How did that man do that? The next tent was labeled with the words, "The Strong Man." Craig snorted at that. He had issues with any guy that claimed to be strong or powerful. Anything that would clash with Craig's own sense of inflated ego. He always had to match and then overtake any sign of aggression. Part of it was the coke that was always coursing through his veins. The bigger part of it, though, was Craig himself. Day by day, he was becoming a monster. And I was too scared to run. We entered the tent, and saw a boulder sitting in the middle. It was about the size of a truck engine, and was surrounded by small shards of similar rocks. We circled the large rock, inspecting it. It was stony, obsidian, and looked alien in its shape and structure. I leaned down to touch it, but a voice called out to be careful. Our attention shot across the tent to the exit, where the strong man stood. He was young, in his late 20s. He looked like he'd been a farmhand. Someone who grew up building muscle from daily chores and was now made of iron. But he wasn't intimidating. There was a softness to him. And like the drowning man in the previous tent, he held the same sorrow across his face. We locked eyes and it immediately felt like the tent got warmer. The strong man approached our group in the boulder. His eyes never left mine. I realized he was carrying a frightening looking sledgehammer. The long, thick handle was made of some kind of black wood. The mallet looked to be solid steel and was covered in markings. He also had a white ring on his ring finger. I guess that was a sideshow thing? The strong man motioned for us to take a few steps back. We all did, minus Craig. He stayed put, a foot away from the rock. He was warned again, but again, stayed put. The strong man shrugged, spun the sledgehammer and drove it down into the center of the rock. Shards of the boulder sprayed out, barraging Craig and sending him stumbling back. Darren and Wilco laughed, which threw Craig further into anger. Craig called bullshit on the performance, saying it was a trick rock and he could have done the same. Now, it was the strong man's turn to smirk. He left the tent and came back a moment later, waddling in, carrying a boulder even larger than the previous one. He dropped it amidst the rock rubble from the previous display with a loud thud. The strong man handed the sledgehammer to Craig. Craig took it and lifted the hammer above his head. He slammed it down on the center of the rock. The mallet bounced off the boulder, sending tremors up Craig's arms and causing him to lose grip on the handle. The sledgehammer flew back, flying directly towards me. But at the last second, I felt a hand on my arm, and I was pulled away. The strong man had pulled me safely to the side. Craig liked that even less. He got up and I saw his hand reach in his pocket and slide out his switchblade. It's crazy to think I was happy to see the blade. I was expecting him to pull out a gun. But the strong man had picked up the sledgehammer, and pointed it towards the exit. Our time here was done. We got Craig out, but he was pissed, and was talking about waiting around for the guy in the parking lot later. The next tent came with a more frightening message. It warned, never floss with piano wire. I shuddered. The boys did the last of their coke, and Craig let us in. This was the darkest of the 3 tents. What looked like piano strings hung from the ceiling, several feet apart, like grotesque streamers. They were slicked with something that looked like blood. It was. We followed the path that led through the bloody piano wires into the back corner. where a lone bulb shone from overhead. A frail waif of a woman trembled in the back corner. She had strange tattoos covering the parts of her body we could see. Her hair was thin and stringy, dyed a dark brown from a long time ago. A stained, once white nightgown hung from her malnourished body. But we couldn't see her face, her hunched over back was to us. Craig grew impatient. He flicked his cigarette at her. The butt, still lit, landed in her hair. She picked it out, and appeared to finish it to the filter. Then she turned. I felt my stomach drop through the earth. Tina and Shelley screamed. One louder than the other. The woman had no skin from halfway up her nose, to down under her chin. Her lower cheeks, lips, and chin were just open muscles and nerves. Her dirty teeth were clenched shut. Tina put her hand over her mouth and rushed out of the tent, followed closely by Shelley. The woman started laughing, but kept her jaw tight. Blood squirted out from between her teeth, towards us, but Craig specifically. He stumbled back, through the wet, hanging piano wires. He freaked out, his arms getting tangled in the wires and covering his jacket in streaks of blood. The woman's laughter followed us out of the tent, where Tina and Shelley were both throwing up now. Darren and Wilco were as pale as bone. But Craig was looking from left to right at the other two pathways. I tried to pull him towards the trail that led back to the parking lot, but his arm was stiff. He wasn't finished here yet. I tried to reason with him, but he pulled away and stealthily moved into the dark woods separating the tent walkways. It was about 50 feet between them, but felt longer as we rushed to catch up. And it got darker, like the torches were getting closer but dimmer. I heard whispering around us. Growls. Snickers. Catcalls. Then we got to the pathway, and the entrance to the last tent from choice number 1. The chalkboard said, "Take only what you must take." Craig let us in. The tent was as dark as the others, with a small fire pit burning in the center. Logs jutted out in different directions. But we were the only ones in here. As we got closer to the fire, Tina was the first to notice the logs. They weren't wood. They were forearms, with hands and fingers, crisped and blackened on the ends. It was Craig who noticed the really frightening thing. He recognized the tattoos on one of the forearms sticking out of the fire. In fact, he recognized the entire forearm. It was his. Only, it wasn't, because his forearms were attached to his body. Then I saw a little sparrow tattoo on the inside of one of the skinnier forearms burning in the pit. I looked down at my own arm, and saw the same tiny bird. How was this possible? An utterance from the darkness made us all jump. The deep, frightening voice revealed itself from the shadows. Coming from a man no taller than a baseball bat. His face was distorted into something between a large smile and a scowl. He wore an old tuxedo, and had a white ring on his ring finger. He introduced himself as William Lynch, the proprietor of the show. Craig asked where the other half of him was. Darren and Wilco laughed, which only gave Craig more fuel. He told Lynch they wanted one more show. And he wanted it to be Lynch tap dancing for them. Here. Now. Lynch laughed. Loudly. Like it came from 10 sets of lungs far larger than the tiny man could contain. Craig joined him, and stepped towards Lynch. But as he did, the strong man entered from one end of the tent, carrying his sledgehammer. Behind him, the giant ducked in through the short doorway. He curled down under the tent's roof. Craig turned to the other entrance, but found it blocked by a bulky man, covered in frightening scales like a lizard. A pair of glowing eyes shimmered over the scaled man's shoulder. Something was behind him, in the darkness of the woods. I grabbed Craig's arm. It was shaking. Even he knew the situation was about to ignite. But I found the strong man's eyes. I saw softness in them. He lightly nodded towards the exit on the other end. The scaled man stepped aside, allowing passage. The glowing eyes did too. Craig moved quickly, his true cowardice showing as he rushed out of the tent, alone. He hated being in situations he wasn't in command of. Darren and Wilco, then Tina and Shelley followed quickly behind. I don't know why, but my feet didn't move. I looked back to the strong man, and found his eyes glued to mine. It was like some kind of recognition passed between us. Like a secret had been revealed, one without details but filled with the trust that follows them. Then, Lynch was right beside me, and said, "Miss, it's time to go." I apologized, again, and my feet carried me out of the tent. I floated through the woods, the parking lot, and back to Craig's Firebird. He raged the whole drive home, snorting coke off the back of his hand. But I barely heard any of it, or could think of anything else. I was fixed on the strong man. His eyes. The dark gray. Lost. Maybe more lost than mine. His final expression as I left the tent stuck with me. He didn't want me to leave. And for some reason, I wanted to stay. I had to see him again. The next day, I knew Craig wouldn't be up until dinner or later. Him and the idiots were up until dawn doing more of the coke they were supposed to be selling. I decided to go back to the park, and brought a nice-ish bottle of whiskey. I didn't know what I was going to say, or who would even be around. It was lunchtime, so I imagined there would be a few of the members of the show scattered about. I walked through the lot and could see small smoke trails from little fire pits. I followed them to the trailers, where I saw an old, frail man pouring coffee. When he saw me, he froze. I told him I was looking for someone, and asked if he knew. I realized I didn't know the guy's name. So I just called him the strong man performer. The old man knew who I was talking about, and struggled off behind a series of old RVs. He looked to be close to 100 years old. As I waited, I felt eyes on me, but couldn't tell from where. Just that they were out there. Then, footsteps from the RVs. The strong man was approaching me, a confused smile on his face. We introduced ourselves. He told me his name was Riot. An old epithet that stuck with him. He apparently had a bit of a temper. We spent the afternoon together, and I got to meet Alonzo, the frightening-looking man with the scaled skin from the tent last night. He was a Vietnam vet, and had contracted some strange, shingles-related disease from an untested chemical weapon released on his squad during jungle warfare. Alonzo was frightening to look at, especially since his iris had gone white. His hands had swelled and distorted into claws. Everything about him looked predatory. But he was a kind man. He'd seen things on his tours in the war. Things that would shatter most men. Cause them to take their own lives. Not Alonzo, though. He could never bring himself to end it. And when Lynch found him on the street, he gave him an accepting home. I met other members as well, and sitting with them, Riot and Alonzo made me feel like I was a part of their family. If only for a small slice of the day. Before I left to go back to the school bus fire that was my own volatile family and home life, Riot asked if we could meet for drinks that night. I agreed without an ounce of guilt, though I hoped Craig would be out with the clowns tonight. We met at a small dive bar. Riot told me about his life. Parents dying, being abandoned, finding his way to the sideshow. Finding a home there. As he was talking, I was hit by the strangest thought. But it immediately took over. What if I went with him? What if I just packed up and left and went with the show wherever they were going? I wouldn't take any money or drugs or anything from Craig that wasn't mine. I'd just go. Maybe he wouldn't notice. Maybe something bad would happen and he'd. I dunno. What was I doing staying anyway? What was I holding on to? I felt like I was sitting in the basement of a burning house waiting for a never-arriving fire department to put out the blaze with water balloons. 2 hours later, Riot and I were making out in the back of the bar. We drove out to Far Point Bluffs in his pickup, and slept together under the stars. I woke up in his arms, positive I'd fallen in love. But the show was leaving after tomorrow night's performance. I told Riot I wanted to go with them. He told me the show was for anyone, but not for everyone. And the people who stayed on, were the ones who found exactly what they were looking for by being there. It found them exactly when they needed to find it. I told him I was in. He said to take the day to think about it, and that he'd drop me off at home now. He needed to be back at the trailers early. As we drove back, I knew I didn't have anything to think about. The last lifeboat of the Titanic was about to pull away. I got Riot to pull over a block away, just in case Craig was awake, or out front. He pulled over, we got out, and he hugged and kissed me. A gunshot roared out and pain streaked through my scalp. I fell against the truck, as Riot hit the ground hard. Another gunshot blasted. And another. Riot was getting hit in the chest repeatedly. Blood started to cover my right eye as I lost my balance and slid down the truck. But I turned to see Craig walking towards us with his Glock out. Oh no. He'd been out front and saw us over here, or maybe when we were driving? It didn't really matter. I realized the shot had caught me in the side of the head, and I was just clinging to consciousness. I watched as Craig walked over to Riot's body. But it wasn't Riot's body anymore. It was an old man's, the same old man I'd seen making coffee. The one who went to get Riot for me when I first came to visit. Riot's strong, imposing figure was replaced by a weak, thin senior who looked to be pushing 100 years old. He had 5 gunshot wounds in his chest, and blood was pooling out from him into the streets. Then the old man started to move. He was alive. His body was shaking and changing. It was elongating, thickening and bulking out. The wounds were healing. The old man was forming back into Riot. Craig stood over him, in utter shock, watching the shapeshifter retake his former appearance. Craig raised the Glock to fire again, but Riot was back to himself now. He shot up, and quickly pulled the much physically weaker Craig to the ground. I watched Riot bend him backwards, Craig's spine snapping and his heels touching his back. Then I blacked out. When I came to, I was in an RV. Riot's. Rain was pattering against the window and I could hear talking, somewhere outside. Then I noticed the ring finger on my left hand. It was occupied. I had one of those white, ivory-looking rings on. I tried to slide it off, but it wouldn't budge. I inspected it closely, and came to an unnerving realization: I couldn't distinguish my skin from the ring. It's like the two were just connected. It was a part of me. I reached up and touched my head. It felt normal. No wounds. Stitches. Even bumps. I actually felt really good. Like, better than I'd ever felt. I took in the surroundings. It was dark, very little light, not too cluttered, clean enough. The door opened and Riot came in. He sat down beside me and said, "We should talk." He explained to me, I was going to die from the gunshot. And the only way to save me was with the ring. Normally, Lynch wouldn't allow such a quick offering of acceptance. But times were extreme, so here we were. And I was alive, because of them. Now that I was awake, I was being afforded one of two options. The first option was I could give back the ring and join Craig being buried in an unmarked grave. Since I knew about them now, they couldn't let me walk away alive. I didn't know what he meant, but asked about the ring. Riot said it was carved from one of Lynch's rib bones. And it gave you a portion of his abilities. The longer you had it, the closer you became to being like him. Not that anyone was that close. Aside from Wanda, the show's lone psychic. With the ring on, you could be hurt. Even badly hurt. But you couldn't die. It would also allow you to change your appearance, in any way you saw fit. You could be any woman, man, mixed or blended with animals or any nightmarish creature you could concoct, within reason. I could be an actual fish woman if I wanted. I could highlight and exaggerate the features I already had and turn myself into a walking atrocity of nature, simply by thought. Or I could be something beautiful. For once. Riot explained how they made real money. They'd pickpocket certain individuals during shows, and mold into the individual's face and appearance the next day. They'd then go to the person's bank, as that person, to empty their accounts. The show members worked together, and the spoils were shared by all. If any investigators ever showed up, everyone would change their appearances, and all would pass over seamlessly. Lynch was a good man, said Riot. There was little the members couldn't do, or try, or experience. They traveled, drank well, partied, scared people for kicks and tried to outdo each other. All kinds of pleasures awaited every night after the performances. This show was even more than a family. But joining came with a warning. When you're in for good. You can't leave. And if you try, there are punishments. The last person who tried to run was the man I'd seen floating in the tube in the first tent. He's been floating in there for over a decade, drowning constantly and in an ever-present fog of unbearable pain. He'd been warned, if and when he got out, that if he ever tried to run again, he'd be turned into the Burning Man, and would spend half a century on fire. I thought of the scariest thing I'd ever seen growing up. Surprisingly, it wasn't the kids who tormented me from a young age. What haunted me was this old scarecrow in the cornfield of a farm I was fostered in from 6 to 8 years old. One of the kids there told me stories about how the scarecrow would come and take some of the kids away that didn't behave. I was terrified of it. Lynch reminded me of that scarecrow. But then there was the choice of having it all end right now. Be buried in an unmarked grave with my boyfriend who tried to kill me. Our bodies never found. Have my name never spoken again. There was a time where the thought brought joy to me. To just pass through this world and out and have no one notice I'd been here. But all of a sudden, the notion brought an overwhelming sadness. All that I hadn't seen or done or experienced. I looked out the window and saw the performers from the sideshow waiting expectantly for my decision. I decided to stay. And for my first show, I spent all day in front of the mirror preparing. It was fascinating, watching subtle changes develop across my face and body as my mind dictated the revisions. It was like I was drawing, but the sketch came out exactly how I wanted it to. A fantasy that was being born into reality. When I stepped out of the RV, I felt like I could float. I'd made myself into an angel. I'd given myself large, white wings I could move around and a full head of platinum blonde hair. I'd shifted my eyes closer together and fixed my mouth. I'd done work on my nose and cheeks and chin. Everything on my body had been perfected over the course of that day. I was perfect. Then I saw Lynch. He was staring at me like I'd pissed on his grave. He started towards me and I stopped in my tracks. Lynch guided me back to Riot's RV and inside he explained to me this isn't what they do. They weren't a brothel. That kind of attraction brings the type of purveyors, like drunk frat guys with things to prove, the show wasn't looking for. I asked him if I could keep it for tonight's show. I'd spent all day working on it, after all. Lynch turned cold. He told me I wasn't getting it, and that he was going to choose for me. He put his hand on mine, our rings touching, and his eyes stared through me. Flashes of the scarecrow streaked through my mind. The worst nightmares I had of it, rolling back into memory. Then I came back too. And I immediately noticed a change. My skin hurt. I looked down and realized there were strands of hay poking out from under my nails. I had chunks of skin missing from my arms that had thicker bundles of hay jutting out. My skin itself was dry and rough. I rushed into the RV's tiny bathroom and checked myself in the mirror. Parts of my face were splitting open, with more tufts of hay spilling out. My right eye was ripping open from it. And I felt it all. Lynch had made me into the scarecrow. I'm starting to think an unmarked grave with Craig was the better option.